Welcome back, everyone. After a technical issue that we have been able to resolve, so sorry about that, but everything should be good to go. So we don't want you to miss any of this because everything we've been talking about with our outreach team is so important. It impacts you, every single one of you. So we're going to go ahead and cover some ground again so you don't miss out. Well, we're talking about the legislative session and what's been happening so far. We know that our outreach team from the John Locke Foundation is at the legislature every day, really helping to inform and educate North Carolinians about what's going on. So before they make their policy decisions, Becky Gray is Senior Vice President of the outreach team of the John Locke Foundation, and Leah Byers and Jordan Roberts are Government Affairs Associates. So folks, thanks so much for staying with us here. The big thing, Becky, I want to talk about first is Governor Roy Cooper and his emergency powers, because I was looking at some statistics and it's really fascinating what's happening in our state. This is very good news. 56% of North Carolina adults have at least one jab of the COVID-19 vaccine. 53% of North Carolina adults are fully vaccinated. Our positivity rate of cases is down to 3.1%, the last data available from DHHS. You may recall that Dr. Mandy Cohen, for months and months, had said that we needed to get down to 5%, which was representative of community spread in North Carolina. We're well below that. We know that when it comes to the most vulnerable North Carolinians, those folks most likely to fall ill and seriously ill to COVID-19, 65 plus, 80% of North Carolinians who are older than 65 are fully vaccinated. Add to all of that the fact that the CDC just days ago revised their guidance to say that vaccinated teachers and students do not need to wear masks inside a classroom. You look at all of that, Becky, and then it's a real head scratcher as to why Governor Roy Cooper continues to hold North Carolina under a state of emergency. What is happening?
Yep, kind of brings you back to the flatten the curve days, right? Whatever happened to that.
Right.
Yeah, and here we are, Donna, as you've mentioned these statistics, most North Carolinians are vaccinated. When you're looking at the federal guidelines, it would appear that we could get out from under this and get our lives back to normal. But yet here in North Carolina, we continue to be under Governor Cooper's executive orders for this state of emergency that has gone on for, what is it now, 16, 17 months we've been under this. In March of 2020, I think when we were getting news of all of this, there was a tremendous amount of fear, a lot of uncertainty for businesses, for what the impact of this was going to be. And as like with other emergencies, whether it's a hurricane or a storm or mudslides in the western part of the state or other kinds of emergencies, North Carolina's Constitution makes it clear that the governor is authorized to respond to that state of emergency. But nobody ever intended for that to go on for months and months and months, and that one person would have unilateral power to close schools, to shut down businesses, to make people stay in their homes for an indefinite amount of time. So we really have tried to revisit this, and the General Assembly has, 4 or 5 separate bills that would address this state of emergency so that it would, for the next emergency, no matter what that is, that there's some restrictions put on that. As a matter of fact, this is embedded in the Senate budget, one of the things that they have put in the budget. And this would just really, again, allow the governor of North Carolina, no matter who it is, to have authority for a very short amount of time, but then that decision would go to the Council of State so that there would be some conference of, again, if you're going to shut down the schools, shouldn't you be talking to the superintendent of public instruction? If you're talking about shutting down businesses, shouldn't you be talking to the Commissioner of Labor, the Commissioner of Agriculture? All of this just kind of makes sense. And then after a certain amount of time, and by the way, the Council of State are elected statewide, just like the governor is. So, this, again, if you look at this all makes sense. Then some of the decisions at that point, they would bring in the representative government of the General Assembly to, again, weigh in on these things. The governor has, unfortunately, this whole discussion has become very political. And when there's any movement about, shouldn't we put some common sense provisions in here, then you're immediately attacked as being partisan for doing it. These new laws, these new guardrails on the governor's emergency powers would be in effect no matter who the governor is. And I think that's just a common sense thing that we would want to do. In the meantime, the governor has held on to this. He has held on to the state of emergency. And the one thing, Donna, that I think, we have to realize is the governor owns this. Governor Cooper owns this. He has not conferred with the Council of State. He has not conferred with the General Assembly. He has vetoed things. There have been lawsuits brought against that he has fought tooth and nail. So for good or bad or indifferent, this whole response to the pandemic is on Governor Cooper's shoulders, and he's going to have to assume the responsibility for it. And the longer that it goes on and the more restrictive it is, and as you've kind of, laid out these data points, the less sense that it makes. He's the one that's going to have to justify this. And I think he's going to have a real hard time explaining to parents in another month or 6 weeks when kids are going back to school that their kids have to wear masks or, some of the other restrictions that continue to be in place. So I agree with you. It seems silly. It seems to me like it's time to get out of these political arguments. Let's talk about some common sense and some things that make sense and that will work for the people of North Carolina.
We're going to get back to this issue in just a few minutes here because we're going to talk more about where the state budget stands. And in that Senate budget that did receive several Democratic votes, then it does contain that provision about changes to the emergency powers. And you made such an important point, Becky. This is not as if the legislative leadership or the Republicans in the Senate are trying just to target Roy Cooper. No, they're talking about reforms that would impact whoever sits in the seat of governor of North Carolina. It could be a Democrat, could be a Republican, but it's just an issue of should one person have unilateral long-term power? That's the issue they're trying to get at based on what we've seen here for more than a year. So I want to go to Leah and Jordan as well, because I know, folks, that you have been taking a look at certain issues that you have been following. And Jordan, let's start with you, since you also are a healthcare policy analyst. You filled that role for several years here at the John Locke Foundation. I know that you've been watching some of those things and a couple of things related to, get this, folks, the word vices. Jordan, what's up with all of that?
Yeah. So for folks who are familiar, I was a healthcare policy analyst before I moved over to the government affairs team. So it's particularly in this time where we're dealing with a global pandemic, hopefully coming to the end of it here. There's been a lot of talk about healthcare and the healthcare system that we have in this state. And so it's been interesting to see what types of policies, what types of bills have been moving forward there, talking about coverage and supply and things like that. We can get into them a little bit more, but also on the regulatory side, like Donna mentioned, we've been talking about some topics that we really haven't talked about a lot here in North Carolina, including medical marijuana and gambling. So it's been really interesting to see, what types of stakeholders are on either sides of those issues, and how our state, going forward is going to deal with those issues. And then, there's also been a lot of talk about regulations on businesses and things like that. And one of the bills that I'm most excited about is a regulatory sandbox bill. It deals with new and innovative technologies and businesses that are coming onto market. So there's been a lot of fun stuff this session, and looking forward to talking about it more.
So are we. We're going to circle back to you in just a minute here. But Leah, you have been watching K-12 education, and my goodness, we know that public policy on education is always top of mind to North Carolinians. But Leah, now with many, many controversial issues and parents having gotten this up close and personal view of their kids' education through COVID-19, many parents now having to supervise their kids in front of a computer. What have you had your eye on this session?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Donna, that the pandemic and the school closures as a result of the pandemic, they really opened a lot of parents' eyes to what was actually going on in the K-12 public education system in North Carolina. And part of that has to do with the quality of the education that they're receiving in some cases, or maybe things like bullying and with cyberbullying and whatnot. And so, but then part of it, I would say a large part of it has to do with political indoctrination. So what values are K-12 public schools, taxpayer-funded government-run schools in North Carolina, what kind of values are they instilling in students that parents then wish that, they wouldn't, that they would leave it to them, leave the parenting, leave the values to the families. And schools have really stepped over that line in a lot of cases, as we're learning through the pandemic. And so there's one bill in particular that would seek to provide some transparency and some sunshine, even as things get back to normal. It's House Bill 755, which would basically require that public school teachers post their materials and their lesson plans onto like a Google Doc or an online form that's accessible to the public, where parents or stakeholders could get on and find out really what's being taught in our schools. And, there's a lot to be said about how people would behave when there's light versus when they're in the dark. And so, and I'm not implying any kind of bad motives, but it makes you think, this is going to be out there for everyone to see. I'm going to consider each choice, very carefully. And parents at the end of the day, want to know what's going on. But then also, if they're not happy with what's going on, it's very important that they have somewhere to go. And so part of that demand is a demand for more school choice programs in North Carolina. So how can the state transform its thinking from this model of we're just going to provide more and more money to our government-run schools that are providing this one kind of product, versus how can money follow the child? Because our mission is really to educate every child in North Carolina, and we know that every child is different and their education needs are different. And so I think that policymakers in the General Assembly are trying to take advantage of that increased demand and vocal outcry for school choice. But as we've mentioned, Roy Cooper is always a factor, and the governor's veto is kind of looming when they try to pass those bills. So we do have a school choice expansion of our Opportunity Scholarship Program, which provides scholarships for low-income children to attend private school. That is in the Senate budget. We'll see if it makes it to the final budget, and then if that budget can be signed into law, or a veto could be overridden and that could become law. So we'll have to see how that plays out with the budget.
Becky, Leah brings up such an important point about all of this, and that is one person, Governor Roy Cooper, because even though North Carolinians have for several elections now overwhelmingly endorsed fiscally conservative Republican lawmakers, they put the Republicans back in charge of the General Assembly for several different cycles now, but they've also reelected Governor Roy Cooper, a Democrat who has some very different views on some key policy issues. Education is one of them. In fact, Donna King at CarolinaJournal.com today wrote a really fascinating piece about not only the number of Roy Cooper vetoes, he is approaching a record here, but the key role that he plays, even though the Republicans are in charge of the General Assembly. So how does it work? The Republicans are passing these particular policy reforms and ideas, but then one person can really just take them down.
Yeah, exactly. And we've seen this really the whole time that Governor Cooper has been the governor, that he is serving his second term now. And Donna, just, a couple quick points. Governor Cooper has vetoed every single budget that the General Assembly has passed over to him. Now, there have been cases in the past where some of the Democrats have joined with the Republicans to override those vetoes, but there are situations, and it seems to become, as we continue to become more and more politically polarized, it seems to be worse, where the General Assembly can pass a bill even with Democratic support. It goes to the governor, he vetoes it. Now, that's not the end of the story. The story then is the bill goes back to the General Assembly, and perhaps the General Assembly has an opportunity to override the governor's veto, which then would put that provision, whatever it is, into law. But what we've seen is the governor vetoes the bill, and then, there's some strong arm tactics and some other pressure that is put on the Democratic members of the caucus that vote with the governor, refuse to override his vetoes, where it becomes a party question. It's no longer a policy question. And that's troublesome to me, in that I think that there are, that the constituents in those members' districts are not being served well when the decision and the representation is made on political strong arm tactics rather than really listening to your constituents and what might be best for them. So the situation that we have this session is in the Senate, it would take 2 Democratic votes with all of the Republican votes in order to override a gubernatorial veto. In the House, it's 3 Democratic votes with all of the Republicans. And what we've seen is, we're still, it feels like to the 3 of us, it feels like we have been in session forever. They went in the end of January. We've still got at least a month to go. So there's still a lot of things out there. But what we've seen are some of the bills. The Senate budget is a good example. The Senate budget had 4 Democrats vote with the Republicans in favor of the Senate budget. You would think that would be an indication that if it comes back, if the governor vetoes it, and we're still a ways away from that, but if the governor were to veto it and it would come back, that there would be a pretty good chance of at least 2 of those 4 would vote to override the veto. So we'll see what those dynamics are looking like, but it's been a real power play between the General Assembly and the governor. And then the other thing that you have to think about too is because he has been so liberal with his veto stamp, he has vetoed more bills than all the other governors combined. I mean, he's got, I think Donna King's article this morning was 57 vetoes that he has, clearly more than the other governors have had. And so then the question becomes, is the General Assembly even going to send things over there knowing that he's going to veto them? I think in some cases they're sending it over and just saying, we believe this is good policy. This is what we believe the people of North Carolina elected us to do. If the governor chooses to veto it, so be it. So that's...
Vicki, let's talk a little bit more with you and the team here about some of the components of that Senate budget that, as you mentioned, did receive votes from 4 Democrats in the Senate. So right now, that is the document that has been passed, and we know that it is nowhere near at this point heading over to Governor Cooper. Lots of negotiations to go on still in the General Assembly. But there's some amazing things in here that are just so good for North Carolinians, particularly vulnerable, low income, modest income North Carolinians. And the Republican leadership in the Senate has really gone out of its way to try to target that population, to bring them along with the prosperity that we've enjoyed so far, even despite the pandemic, and what we all hope will be a really, really solid rebound. A couple of things, that 0 tax bracket would increase up to $25,500. And Becky, to me, that is just such a diamond in this document, because if you are a moderate income household or a low income household, that first, it would be $25,500 of the money that you earn would be tax-free, 0 taxes. That is such a help, people keeping more of what they earn.
Yeah, and Donna, it's really the whole tax package does that. You're right. Now, another thing that I really like on that is that it increases the per child tax credit. And what I think this does is it sends a strong message to North Carolinians that the elected officials, those that have voted for this budget, believe in the value of family, and that children and families are a resource worth investing in. And I think that's a strong message. And again, that's across the board to all families. The other thing is, in this tax package that they've proposed, it would decrease the personal income rate. So as you mentioned, it increases the 0 tax bracket, but for small businesses who file as under the personal income banner, as well as everybody else who pays personal income, that would be reduced. And then to phase out the corporate income tax, what you're really doing is, you're helping out the job creators and the people that are coming here to expand and to bring their jobs to North Carolina, to expand those jobs, because, Donna, talking about how do we help people who need our help the most? I mean, the best way out of poverty is to have a job. And so to do these things that really expand the economic opportunities for people is huge. And then some other thing, Leah can talk more about this, but, this whole thing she mentioned about the opportunity scholarships, about expanding school choice. That's the other thing for hardworking North Carolina families to be able to offer their children the best educational opportunities to go on to succeed, to be well skilled in order to get jobs. This is all part of that whole, as you mentioned, the budget that really works for all North Carolinians. Another big thing they've got in there is broadband and infrastructure and making the right kind of investments as we look at the future of North Carolina. Is this a good place to start a business? Is it a good place to work? Is it a good place to raise a family? A lot of those things are taken into consideration in the budget.
Jordan, I was taking a look at Brian Balfour's piece from a few days ago, available at johnlocke.org, about some of the key components in the Senate budget package and healthcare. Brian really pulled out a couple of interesting things, and this is near and dear to your heart, Jordan, I know, because it would apparently scale back, at least in a modest term, the certificate of need law in North Carolina, which you have written for several years about how that is so anti-competitive and it really keeps healthcare costs artificially high and restricts our access to care. You must be really happy to see that component.
Yeah, we would love to see a lot more certificate of need reform this session, but this, sort of certificate of need light, if you will, reform is a great step forward. And what it does is, for those who aren't familiar, certificate of need laws require that healthcare providers, healthcare entrepreneurs, if they're building or expanding new healthcare facilities, they need to get a permission slip from the government. And the way that calculation works is if a project is above a certain price threshold, then it would trigger the certificate of need review. So what this bill would do is it would raise, I believe, triple those thresholds for triggering a certificate of need process for new projects. And then the best part, I think, is that it also indexes it to inflation, because these prices have been at the same level for a number of years. So we know healthcare price inflation increases higher than normal inflation. So I think it's a way to take care of this issue. Short of full repeal, it's a way to sort of keep it in check with just the general rate of increase. And then another thing that really stuck out to me in this budget, we again talking about this pandemic and all the health related outcomes and consequences, are the mental and behavioral health aspect of what we've just been through for the last 18 months. And we know that there are a lot of people in North Carolina that are either had mental health issues or behavioral health issues exacerbated, or new issues came up during the pandemic. And so I think the Senate budget really puts an emphasis on mental and behavioral health. It provides a lot of funding for new psych beds, new telepsychiatry programs at ECU and one at Atrium. And then it also provides money for an urgent care behavioral health program. So again, a lot of emphasis on, we know we have these needs. So what's the best way that we can utilize resources we have and make sure that people get the help they need, especially with mental and behavioral health issues that can persist and become very, very bad for the individual and costly for folks. So that was one thing that stuck out to me too in the healthcare space.
And certainly one would hope that that's something that Democrats and Republicans can agree upon there. And speaking of mental health issues and things like that, Leah, I know that one of the fascinating outgrowths, so to speak, of going through the COVID-19 pandemic is to watch parents and other relatives of kids not only have to supervise their education, but suddenly starting to understand kind of the emotional underpinnings of these kids that they may not have realized fully before. But when you see aptitudes and challenges, and you see firsthand a child reacting one way or another to the situation, being in front of a computer screen, it just screams out for parents being able to decide what's best for their particular child. And Leah, I've always found it fascinating that some people want to cast school choice as being somehow anti-public school, and I've never seen it that way at all. If someone wants to choose a traditional district classroom, as far as I'm concerned, fine, if that works for them and they think that's best. But these kids are having all sorts of very personal, individual challenges. And it just really, I think, sets the stage for more people to say, you know what, I think I need something a little bit different for my child right now.
You're absolutely right. And we know that parents might make a choice for their child that is not a traditional public school for a variety of reasons, or they might choose which public school to attend for a variety of reasons. But every decision that a family makes is going to be based on what's best for their child. And we have to ultimately believe that parents and guardians have their students' best interests at heart. And you're absolutely right that support for school choice is not contradictory to support for traditional public schools. And in fact, the two are very closely, support for one is closely related to support for another. So what do we know about competition in a market environment? It's that it encourages innovation, it encourages quality to go up. As traditional public schools are faced with competition, be that from public charter schools, from private schools, then they are forced to be more in touch with what parents and students are actually demanding in their educational product, because all of a sudden the money and the funding is not guaranteed to them based on how many students live in their area. But instead, if the money follows the child, then the traditional public schools have to produce a product worth choosing. And I think that that's a great thing. And it's not that there's so many principals and teachers out there that are truly trying to do that already in our traditional public schools. But as a state, we need to encourage them. We need to not tie their hands behind their back. We need to give them the ability to learn and to grow and adapt to meet these parental needs. And part of that includes, more accountability and getting rid of the ones that are not rising to that challenge. And so, I would say that that's a big myth. And expanding school choice, because when we say expanding school choice as well, I'll just note this: in the Senate budget, expanding the Opportunity Scholarship Program, we know that this is expanding school choice for those who otherwise cannot access it. So if you are of well enough means, you can live in a school district where the public school is really good. And so you can have those resources to be able to move to where you need to move to get into the school that you want your child to be in, or you have the resources to pull them out and send them to a private school using your own resources. And so I think it's only fair to those parents who are tax-paying parents and their children are North Carolina children, that they have the same options, even if they don't have the resources to be able to have that on their own.
Becky, education, of course, top of mind, particularly now for all the reasons we've been talking about, that up close and personal relationship parents now have with education. Now questions about exactly what is my child being taught in their classroom and by their teacher, and that, of course, manifesting itself into the bill about academic transparency and what should parents be able to see at the end of a school year about the notes or the curriculum, the syllabus that the teacher has been using. But Becky, the other big issue in our state is our voting laws, election laws. And here at the Locke Foundation, of course, we have a Center for Public Integrity run by Dr. Andy Jackson that looks at the issue of trying to secure our elections, making sure they are safe and they are free, and that every legally cast vote is counted. And I know that there's been some activity in the legislature geared towards that. Give us a sense, if you could, of what's been happening on that issue so far.
Yeah, and that's been a really interesting discussion. And again, if there's a theme this year, it's probably after the pandemic, what do we do? What are we left with? And so think of a lot of the questions around election reform, and what we should be looking at is looking at the election of 2020, when there were a lot of special provisions put into place. We had a lot more mail-in voting during that because people were afraid to leave their homes to go to the polling places. So it's looking at as many things, whether it's education, as Leah's talked about, whether it's healthcare, as Jordan has talked about. This gives us an opportunity to think about what lessons did we learn from the pandemic. And the election integrity is one of those where, let's look at this again, particularly with the mail-in ballot question of, how long should you be allowed to return your ballot? There was wide swaths allowed, again, because we were going through a pandemic. And, some political things, some political questions with it too. But, that's one reason why we have really expanded our Center for Election Integrity, is to look at those things to ensure that the integrity of the election is protected, so that people feel confident when they go to the ballot place that their vote is actually going to count. And so a lot of this is revolving around mail-in ballots. A lot of it is, there were some decisions made that were outside of the General Assembly that our Attorney General made, that there have been movements that not happen again. So there's several things. Some of these were wrapped into the Senate budget. Others are being considered separately in the House. A lot of that is still in flux, but that is one that we feel like is important at the John Locke Foundation, and the General Assembly has reflected that as well. That, as you said, elections should be fair. People should be able to vote. The question of the voter ID is one that continues to come up. So it's looking at all of those things. I don't know, Leah or Jordan, do y'all want to jump in on any of the election things that are being considered?
Yeah, so I can just add real quickly on, you alluded to the collusive settlements bill. So this is basically, the Attorney General and the State Board of Elections, they used a kind of sue and settle strategy when they didn't get the elections reforms that they wanted through the General Assembly or through the Rules Commission. And so they decided to have a lawsuit where both parties agreed, and then they could settle, and get what they wanted in the end, and change election law without having to go through the legislature. And so this year, the legislature, each chamber has passed a different bill. Each one has passed their own bill about prohibiting those kind of actions, and basically saying if the General Assembly is a party to the lawsuit, then they have to be included in the settlement agreement. And Andy Jackson, as you mentioned, he called this the most important bill for elections this year that is not an election bill. And so that's one that I'm keeping an eye on. I think it's very, very important for our election security, because if the General Assembly puts all the work into shoring up our election laws, but then these outside parties or in the executive branch can just sue each other and settle and get whatever they want anyway, then, what happens? What does that say about our legislative process and how our laws are supposed to be made and changed in North Carolina?
And Leah, those collusive settlements, it's really so counterintuitive, because normally when you think lawsuit, that means that you have two entities that disagree vehemently on something. And so they're going to court to try to duke it out and figure out which one of them wins. But in this case, this sue and settle strategy, they agree, but they're going to court just to get the settlement they want. So it's really fascinating. I'm glad that you are following it, and that Andy Jackson is following it from the Locke Foundation's Center for Public Integrity as well. Jordan, I got to circle back with you and talk about marijuana and gambling, because they have come up in this legislative session. These are two issues that the Locke Foundation hasn't had, in my recollection at least, a lot of time devoted to. Gambling a little bit. When we went through the North Carolina lottery situation a few years ago, a government-run, government-endorsed lottery, which the Locke Foundation opposed based on the fact that it's government-run. But marijuana, tell us about that.
Yeah, so this year, a bill sponsored by the Senate Rules Chairman and a fellow Democratic Senate member, Senators Bill Rabon and Paul Lowe, they introduced what they call the Compassionate Care Act, which would allow medical marijuana in North Carolina for a very select, limited list of conditions. And so it started to go through the committee process in the Senate, and it's been really interesting to watch, to hear some of these private or public comments from folks that would have an interest in this. North Carolina, traditionally a lot more socially conservative state on issues like marijuana. So it's interesting, one, that the bill is getting a hearing. It seems to have some momentum. It has bipartisan momentum. And, I think any of us that have heard some of those stories in the committee hearing of some of these veterans or things like that would benefit from it. It's certainly a compelling issue and an interesting one for North Carolina. And then on the other hand, there's also been talk of After a couple years after the Supreme Court allowed states to legalize sports gambling, we now have a bill introduced in both chambers here in North Carolina that would allow online sports wagering and set up a really robust and regulated marketplace for this. And as you said, the Locke Foundation was very against the education lottery. So, this is an interesting dynamic now. Do we make it available to private actors? Should it be monopolized by the state? Is that really fair? So it's a lot of interesting questions. And, if you look around to other states, they've been able to bring in hundreds of millions of dollars in revenue just by legalizing sports gambling. So it could be another way for the state to raise some money on, something that a lot of people are already doing in our state. So it's just, in our traditionally conservative state on a lot of issues, these two issues are really interesting.
And Becky, I know that you also have been following very closely the issue of energy, and knowing here that we talk a lot here at the Locke Foundation and write a lot about the fact that lowest cost energy is so important to people, and that market forces are already starting to ensure that our air is cleaner, our water is cleaner, etc. But energy has taken a high profile in the legislature this year. We know that Governor Cooper endorses the so-called renewable sources that are costly, subsidized, really aren't ready for prime time, so to speak, in the marketplace to be able to stand on their own, versus nuclear and natural gas, which are providing the majority of the energy here in North Carolina.
Yeah, and again, kind of to Jordan's point, on a lot of these issues, the Locke Foundation may or may not take positions on it, but it really opens it up to some really interesting discussions that the three of us are lucky enough to be privy to a lot of these. And the energy question is one that, we've looked at in a number of years. As a matter of fact, we commissioned a special study, the Energy Crossroads in North Carolina. We commissioned the study way back in January, not knowing at that time that there would be a big comprehensive energy bill that would be introduced just a couple of weeks ago in the General Assembly. So it's one, again, really interesting. And from a policy standpoint, all of the different options. As you mentioned, the governor and others in the state, his administration, has taken the position of renewables are the greatest thing, and he's got a clean energy plan, very much that leaning that way, which is a very expensive way to go with your energy policy. What this latest bill does is it takes more of a combination of, what we know is coal-fired plants are being retired just for a number of reasons. That horse has already left the barn. They are winding down the coal-fired plants. But if you're interested in efficient, reliable, low-cost energy, and low-emission energy, you have to look at nuclear and natural gas as really the choices. There is a place for renewables, and because of laws and policies that have been put in place earlier, that will be a part of the mix, but it's that percentage of the mix that you get into and what the cost drivers are. And until there's really widespread technology for battery storage for solar and wind and some of the renewable things, it really is impractical and very expensive to go that way. So we're at an energy crossroads. Highly recommend the paper that we've done at the Locke Foundation on that. Very informative. If you're like me and don't know a whole lot about energy policy, it was a really good primer for me to kind of get my head wrapped around some of these questions and the pros and the cons of different types of energy sources that we have. But that's one that the bill was introduced. It's moving. There's a lot of discussion about it, and it's one we'll be watching. But again, what we're looking for is low cost, reliable, efficient energy sources, and to put those in place for a long-term plan in North Carolina. So we'll be reporting on that in Carolina Journal and some of the other work that we're doing. But again, another interesting issue that's working its way through the General Assembly.
So before we close today, I want to make sure that everyone understands where they can follow all of you on social media in order to get real-time updates as to what's happening at the General Assembly. Becky, as you mentioned, probably got at least another month or so to go in the session. So first of all, folks, the John Locke Foundation, at John Locke NC on Twitter. Carolina Journal on Twitter is at Carolina Journal. Becky, Jordan, and Leah, I'm going to go to each one of you. Where can people find you? Becky, let's start with you.
I'm very active on Twitter, and it's at Becky Gray, BECKIGRAY, and often tweet and comment from committee meetings throughout the day and other information. And I rely heavily on John Locke and Carolina Journal as well.
Jordan?
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Jordan Roberts NC, and please don't tweet anything rude about the Panthers if you do follow me.
That's right. Sports definitely in his feed there. And Leah, how about you?
I'm on Twitter as well, and my name is just at Leah Byers on there, and that's LEAHBYERS.
So that is a great way to stay on top of what's happening at the legislature, in addition to all of the analysis of the proposals, the reforms, et cetera. You're going to find that at johnlocke.org, at carolinajournal.com, with their daily updates, their reports on legislative activities. We have it all for you, folks. We're following this very carefully. And as you can see, our 3-member outreach team, they are there literally every day, watching, helping to answer questions for legislators, helping to get them the information they need in order to make these sound policy decisions. A lot of reforms on the table right now to make sure that here in North Carolina, we make those sound decisions. People are keeping more of what they earn. People have opportunity to support their families, to pass on legacy wealth, to create a new business if they want to do so. That's what it's all about here at the John Locke Foundation. We believe in you. We believe in freedom and giving you the opportunity that leads to all of that prosperity. I want to thank the panel today. Thanks so much, guys, for giving us an update, and we'll let you all go back to work. Folks, I want to thank you for joining us as well. And we would ask one thing of you. If you believe, as we do, in freedom and an opportunity for every North Carolinian, no one should be left behind, we would ask you to consider a tax-deductible donation to help fuel the work that we do here at the John Locke Foundation. Really simple and fast. Go to johnlocke.org. In the upper right-hand corner, there is a donate tab. Just click on that. It takes you less than 2 minutes to make that secure tax-deductible donation to expand freedom here in North Carolina. We would greatly appreciate your support. Thanks so much for joining us. Hope to see you again next Monday for another edition of Shaftesbury Society. On behalf of the entire Locke and Carolina Journal team, I'm Donna Martinez. Have a great week, everybody.